The galaxy was crumbling. Across countless star systems, once thriving worlds were now silent, their lights extinguished by an overwhelming force. This enemy, known only as the Silence, moved through the galaxy like a shadow, leaving nothing but death in its wake. Entire civilizations fell without a fight. The Galactic Alliance, a vast union of over 200 species, was no exception. The once powerful fleets that had defended the galaxy were now reduced to rubble. Even the most advanced defense systems couldn't hold against the brutal, relentless march of the Silence. Every planet that had been touched by this force was left hollow and dead, its people vanished without a trace. Every hope, every dream of victory, seemed lost. The creatures of the galaxy, once proud and powerful, were filled with fear, and with that fear came despair. In the midst of this darkness, there was a single shining light: the humans. A young, volatile species by galactic standards, humanity had been underestimated from the beginning. But in the face of extinction, humans had done something others had forgotten. They believed, while others watched their worlds burn and gave in to the terror of the Silence. Humans had kept fighting. They fought not because they had the strongest weapons or the largest fleets, but because they had something more powerful: hope. The human fleet was small, a mere fraction of the size of the Alliance's greatest forces, but it was also the most determined. In their final hours, when all other species had given up, the humans gathered every remaining ship in their fleet. They had no grand plan, no overwhelming strategy. They only had one thing in mind: survival. Admiral Sarah Callahan, a seasoned leader who had seen the collapse of her own homeworld, stood on the bridge of the U.S. Victory, a battleship that had survived against all odds. She gazed out at the vast emptiness before her, a cold reminder of what they were up against. The Silence was coming, and this time, they wouldn't stop until every last living being was eradicated. But Sarah had seen something in the reports, something no one else had noticed. There was a weakness, a small crack in the Silence's armor, and if anyone was going to exploit it, it would be humanity. In the last meeting of the Alliance's Council, they had discussed surrender. Some of the oldest species had already begun negotiations with the Silence, hoping to preserve what little remained of their civilization. The humans, however, refused to bow down. "We are not finished yet," Admiral Callahan had said, her voice strong and unwavering. "The Silence may have crushed your fleets, but they haven't crushed our will to fight. If we fall standing." Her words had echoed through the council chambers, silencing the murmurs of defeat. It was a rare moment when humans, often seen as reckless and brash, became the voice of reason. The other species had hesitated, unsure of what to do next. But in the end, they had chosen to follow, not because they believed in the humans, but because they had no other choice. The Alliance, once a mighty force, was now scattered and broken, but they rallied behind the humans, unwilling to give up completely. The remaining fleet, a patchwork of ships from various species, assembled in the darkness of space. The humans, though outnumbered, took the lead, navigating through war-torn systems and surviving in hostile environments. There was no more time for hesitation. The Silence was close, and this would be their final chance to make a stand. As the fleet moved towards the edge of the Silence's territory, fear hung in the air like a heavy fog. The crew aboard the U.S. Victory were no different from the others. They knew the odds were slim. They knew that even if they succeeded, many would die. Yet, as Sarah Callahan walked through the halls of her ship, she saw something that gave her a strange sense of hope. The crew was preparing, not with dread, but with determination. Some of them were scared, yes, but none of them were backing down. The humans had something no one else had: the will to fight. It was their greatest weapon, one that the Silence could never understand. The battle began on the fringes of the galaxy, just outside the last known stronghold of the Galactic Alliance. The Silence attacked with overwhelming force, as they always did. Their ships were massive, their weapons far superior to anything the Alliance had. But the humans had learned something during their struggle. The Silence, for all its power, couldn't deal with a species that refused to give up. As the human ships fought valiantly, dodging and weaving through the enemy's onslaught, it became clear that they weren't trying to win. They were trying to survive long enough to reach the heart of the enemy's forces. Through the chaos, Admiral Callahan's voice rang out, calm and steady. All ships, engage at maximum power. We don't retreat. We don't surrender. We fight, together. Her words became the rallying cry for the humans and their allies, and for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, there was hope. The Silence, for all its power, was caught off guard. They had expected the Alliance to crumble, to collapse under the weight of despair, but the humans refused to yield. As the battle raged on, a small fleet of surviving aliens, who had once been enemies of humanity, joined the fight. They had seen the courage of the humans, and for the first time, began to believe. The tide began to turn. The Silence, unable to understand this surge of defiance, struggled to adapt. They had never encountered a species that would fight to the bitter end, no matter the cost. But the battle wasn't over yet. In the final moments, the human fleet made a desperate move. Using a combination of their most advanced weapons and sheer willpower, they launched a final strike against the central control system of the Silence. It was a 1-in-a-million shot, and everyone knew it. But the humans had always believed in impossible odds. They never stopped fighting. As the central core of the Silence began to crumble, the enemy forces faltered. The remaining ships of the Silence, once thought invincible, started to withdraw, their control over the galaxy weakening. The Alliance had done it. Against all odds, humanity had led them to victory. In the aftermath, the surviving species came together, not as enemies, but as allies. They rebuilt, stronger than before. The humans had shown them something they had lost, the power of belief. While others had succumbed to fear, humanity had reminded the galaxy what it meant to stand and fight. In the end, it was hope that had saved them. It was humanity that had brought them back from the edge of extinction. As Admiral Sarah Callahan looked out into the stars once more, she knew that the battle was over, but the journey was just beginning. The galaxy had been saved, but it had been humanity's courage, determination, and unyielding belief that had turned the tide. And that, above all else, was their greatest victory. The galaxy was on the verge of collapse. A dark force known as the Silence had wiped out entire species, consumed vast territories, and left nothing but cold, empty space in its wake. Entire civilizations had fallen without a chance to defend themselves. The greatest armies had been crushed, and the once powerful Galactic Alliance had been shattered. What remained of the once proud union of species was now a small and broken fragment, scattered across the galaxy, clinging to survival. Fear had spread like wildfire, and it seemed as though there was no hope left. No one knew how to fight the Silence. No one knew how to stop the endless wave of destruction. But in the darkest corner of the galaxy, a small human fleet remained. Unlike the others, the humans did not give in to despair. They fought, not because they had the strongest weapons or the largest fleets, but because they had something others had forgotten: belief. Even as their comrades fell one by one, the humans held firm. They refused to surrender. They were determined to stand and fight until the end. As the remaining leaders of the Galactic Alliance gathered in the shadow of their fading hopes, an urgent message was sent across the stars. It was a call for help, a last-ditch effort to save what little remained of the galaxy. The leaders of the various species had come to a grim conclusion. It was time to retreat. The Silence was simply too powerful. No matter how hard they fought, they couldn't win. It was over. The message went out to every corner of the galaxy, urging the remaining forces to abandon their warships and flee to distant, uncharted worlds. It was a message of survival. It was a plea to preserve the last traces of their species, to escape the oncoming storm. Most of the galaxy's civilizations, tired and broken, agreed. They started to evacuate, leaving their homes behind in search of refuge. But there was one species that refused to listen: humanity. Admiral Sarah Kaladin, the leader of the human fleet, stood on the bridge of her flagship, the U.S. Victory. Her hands gripped the railing as she looked out into the vast emptiness. The stars were quiet now, silent. The enemy had already passed through here, and the only thing left in their wake was death. Yet, in this silence, there was something else, a spark. The humans were not running. They would not surrender. "This is madness," said one of her officers, his voice shaky with fear. "The message is clear. We're outmatched. We can't win. No one can." Admiral Callahan didn't respond at first. She simply stared into the dark void of space. Her mind raced, but her resolve was unshaken. The message to retreat had been sent to every corner of the galaxy, but it hadn't reached her ship. Humanity had not received it. They had not been told to run. "No," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We are not retreating. We are staying." The officer looked at her in disbelief. "Are you insane? The others are abandoning their homes, their worlds. They know this battle is lost." "We are not like them," she replied quietly. "We fight. We believe." There was a moment of silence, and then the officer nodded, though doubt still lingered in his eyes. Around him, the crew looked uncertain. They had been through so much, lost so many, and yet they stood here, facing down an enemy that no one had been able to defeat. But in the heart of every human on board, there was something more: hope. It was fragile, but it was there. As the fleet prepared for what might be their final battle, Sarah ordered all remaining ships to assemble. The humans would make their stand. They would send a message to the galaxy, a message that even in the face of certain defeat, humanity would never give up. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the other species had already begun their retreats. Great fleets of alien ships scattered into the unknown, abandoning their homes, their families, and their pride. They thought that by running, they might survive. But they didn't know the truth that humans did. There is no future in surrender. The human fleet moved into position near the edge of enemy territory, deep within the heart of silence-controlled space. They were alone. No allies came. No reinforcements would arrive. They would face the silence head-on, with nothing but their strength, courage, and resolve. Sarah's orders were simple: engage, fight, and survive. The silence had no mercy. They had no emotion. They were a force of nature, a machine, an unstoppable tide of death. Their ships were massive, their weapons far superior to anything the humans had. Yet, as they closed in on the human fleet, something strange began to happen. The human ships did not retreat. They did not cower. Instead, they fought with a fury that even the silence could not anticipate. The human fleet took position, locking their weapons on the nearest targets, engaging the enemy with everything they had. The silence retaliated with overwhelming firepower, but the humans, though outnumbered, were relentless. The battle was brutal. Explosions lit up the void of space. Ships from both sides were torn apart. Yet, despite the losses, the human fleet held firm. They refused to back down. Every ship in the fleet fought as if it was their last, because, for many of them, it was. But there was something else happening. The message, the one that had been ignored, was starting to reach the distant corners of the galaxy. As the humans held their ground, something shifted in the hearts of other species. From one system to the next, news began to spread. The humans were not retreating. They were not giving up. They were still fighting. And for the first time in months, some of the species who had already fled began to question their decision. Could they have fought longer? Could they have done more? The message humanity had sent by simply standing firm was more powerful than anything they had ever imagined. The message wasn't one of survival. It was a message of defiance. Across the stars, a small but powerful change began. The other species, still hiding in their distant refuge worlds, started to make a decision. They would not abandon the galaxy without a fight. They would join the humans. But it was too late. The battle had reached its peak. The human fleet, battered and bloodied, was making its final stand. Yet, just as all hope seemed lost, something extraordinary happened. The fleet of the galaxy's remaining species, those who had fled at the first sign of danger, turned back. They returned to the fight, drawn by the strength and defiance of humanity. And together, they faced the silence. Together, they fought. The battle raged on for hours, but by the time the first rays of dawn broke across the star systems, the silence began to retreat. They had underestimated humanity. They had underestimated the power of belief. What they saw as a small broken fleet had become the spark that ignited the fire of resistance across the galaxy. In the end, it wasn't the firepower of the humans that turned the tide. It was their refusal to surrender, their message of defiance, and their belief that even in the darkest of times, there was always a chance to fight back. The galaxy was saved not because of strength, but because of something much stronger. The belief that one voice, one fleet, could make all the difference. The war had reached its breaking point. Across the galaxy, the forces of the Krell Dominion were crushing everything in their path. Planets fell one by one, and the once thriving galactic alliances were now fragmented and scattered. Only a few species remained, desperately fighting for their survival. Among them, humanity stood as one of the last hopes, but their situation was bleak. The Krell had advanced too far. Their weaponry, their sheer strength, and their unrelenting nature seemed unbeatable. Yet, against all odds, there was one last hope: the impossible mission. Admiral Marcus Kane, commander of the human fleet, stared at the holographic map that floated before him. His fingers hovered over the glowing symbols, but his mind was elsewhere. The mission he had been tasked with was something no one believed could succeed. It was an operation that no one had dared attempt before. An attack on the Krell's central command ship, the Oblivion. The ship was said to be impenetrable, heavily guarded, and the heart of the Krell's entire war machine. Taking it down would require more than just bravery. It would require a miracle. But that was all the humans had left now. Miracles. "We're running out of time, sir," said Captain Lisa Rivera, her voice heavy with concern. She had been with Kane through countless battles, and she knew that even she was beginning to doubt whether this mission was possible. "If we don't act soon, there will be nothing left to save." Kane nodded but didn't speak immediately. The weight of the situation hung heavily on him. If they failed, there would be no escape, no refuge. The entire galaxy would be consumed by the Krell. But if they succeeded, they could strike a blow so devastating that the Krell would be forced to retreat, buying time for the rest of the galaxy to regroup. "Prepare the fleet," Kane ordered, his voice steady despite the uncertainty that gripped his heart. "We leave in 20 minutes. As the fleet of human ships moved into formation, tension was thick in the air. Every crew member knew what was at stake, but it wasn't just about survival. It was about sending a message. The humans had been beaten back again and again, but they would not go quietly. If the galaxy was to have a future, it would be because of their fight. The journey to the Krell's stronghold was long and perilous. The human ships had to move through territory already occupied by the enemy, and the closer they got to the Oblivion, the more dangerous the mission became. The Krell ships patrolled every corner, and the human fleet was outnumbered, their chances of success diminishing with every passing moment. Yet they pressed forward, the human spirit refusing to bend. The moment they arrived within striking distance, the first wave of Krell warships appeared on the horizon, massive and imposing. Admiral Kane's heart raced as he looked over the comms feed. A small team of fighter pilots had already launched, their mission to disable the outer defenses of the Oblivion, to give the main fleet a chance to infiltrate. "Here we go," Kane muttered, gripping his chair tighter. "All ships, prepare for battle." The chaos of battle erupted almost instantly. Explosions filled the vastness of space, and the stars seemed to disappear in the flurry of fire and destruction. The human fleet held their ground, but it was clear that they were being overwhelmed. The Krell were relentless, pushing forward in wave after wave, their ships unfazed by the onslaught. But the humans did not falter. Their ships fought as one, a symphony of destruction. Though the cost was steep, one by one, the smaller human vessels were picked off, their crews lost to the void. In the midst of the chaos, Kane's voice rang out over the comms. "Deploy all remaining fighters. We're getting to the Oblivion, no matter the cost." Lisa Rivera, her face grim, nodded and gave the order. The fighters launched, and the rest of the human fleet followed. The Oblivion loomed large ahead, its terrifying weapons aimed directly at them. The giant command ship was heavily shielded, its defense systems impenetrable by conventional means. But the humans had something the Krell didn't expect: ingenuity. Admiral Kane had devised a plan that, if successful, would allow a small team to board the Oblivion and plant an explosive device within its core. It was a dangerous gamble, one that required precision, timing, and a lot of luck. If they were caught, there would be no escape. The human fleet fought their way through the Krell defenses, pushing closer and closer to their target. Then, as the enemy ships fired relentlessly upon them, the human fighters made their move. They dove deep into the Oblivion's protective shields, engaging in a fierce dogfight with the Krell fighters that were guarding it. Meanwhile, a small infiltration team, led by Commander Jack Harmon, slipped onto the Oblivion itself. The ship's sensors were heavily guarded, and they had to move swiftly if they wanted to plant the explosives without detection. Harmon's team fought their way through the corridors of the massive ship, avoiding detection as best as they could. Every step they took brought them closer to their goal, but also closer to being caught. The walls around them seemed to close in with every passing second. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the core. "I'm planting the charge now," Harmon said, his voice tense but steady. As the team set the explosive device, alarms began to blare. The Krell had found them. The infiltration team scrambled to get out, but the corridor was already flooded with Krell soldiers. It was a race against time. Harmon and his team fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. One by one, the soldiers fell. Back outside, the battle raged on, the human fleet fighting with everything they had left. Admiral Kane watched through the comms, his stomach tied in knots. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. The Oblivion seemed invincible, its shields holding strong despite the human efforts to breach them. But then, just as hope began to fade, a blinding flash lit up the battlefield. The Oblivion shook violently. The explosive charge had detonated. For a brief moment, there was silence. The Krell fleet hesitated, their central command ship crippled. But the battle wasn't over. The humans had struck a heavy blow, but the Krell were far from finished. Still, the damage had been done. The Oblivion was no longer the heart of the Krell war machine. The human fleet had created a window of opportunity. "Keep fighting," Admiral Kane ordered. "We have a chance. We will win this day." The battle didn't end immediately, but the turning point had come. With the Krell command ship severely weakened, the human forces rallied, driving the invaders back. The impossible mission had not only succeeded, but it had turned the tide of the war. The galaxy had received a message from humanity. Even when the odds are impossible, even when the enemy seems unbeatable, humanity would never give up. The universe was dying. Across every star system, the endless war raged on, and civilizations were slowly being consumed by it. For years, the galaxy had been under the iron grip of the Yulren Collective, a race of beings so powerful and advanced that no one had dared to stand against them. Every attempt to fight back had been crushed, and hope seemed like a distant memory. Every planet, every species, every form of resistance that had once risen to challenge them had fallen. No one believed they could win, not anymore. But then, in the darkest hour, The impossible happened. A spark of belief was born. Humanity. Admiral Evelyn Blackwood stood in the command center of the human flagship, the Eclipse, staring out at the vast expanse of space. Her face was pale, her eyes tired, and her mind weighed down by the enormity of what lay ahead. The human fleet was small, just a handful of ships scattered across the galaxy, each one battered and broken from years of fighting. They were on the brink of annihilation. And yet, here she was, preparing to lead them into one final mission. The mission that could either bring the galaxy back from the brink of destruction or seal its fate forever. "I'm not sure we can do this, Evelyn," said Captain Max Reaver, his voice heavy with doubt. He had fought alongside her for years, and like everyone else, he had seen the relentless might of the Yulren. They had been pushed to the edge of extinction, and the thought of defying them now seemed like an impossible dream. This isn't a war we can win. The Yulren are too powerful." Evelyn looked at her old friend, her eyes full of determination. She had heard these doubts before, from soldiers, from commanders, from those who had lost their will to fight. The same thoughts echoed through every corner of the human fleet. The truth was, the humans had little left to fight with. Their ships were outdated, their weapons barely functioning, and their numbers dwindling. The Yulren had wiped out so much of their strength that only a handful of resistance fighters remained. But Evelyn believed in something more than tactics, more than firepower. She believed in something that the Yulren had never understood: the power of belief. "We may be small," Evelyn said, her voice firm and resolute, "but we are not powerless. The Yulren underestimated us. They thought we were weak, but we've proven them wrong time and time again. We will fight because we have something they will never have: hope. And as long as we have hope, we have strength." Max didn't respond, but he couldn't argue. There was something about her words, something that ignited a flicker of hope in his heart. The fire that had been smothered by years of war was beginning to burn again, however faintly. With the fleet prepared, Evelyn sent out a rallying call across the galaxy. It was a simple message, one that was broadcasted on every frequency, through every channel, reaching every corner of the universe. "We will rise. Together, we will stand. The Yulren may be strong, but we have something they will never understand. We fight for our freedom, for our future, and for the belief that we can still make a difference. Join us." The response was immediate. It wasn't much at first, just a few scattered ships, a handful of survivors who had heard the call. But it was enough. The spark of belief had been lit, and it began to spread. Across the galaxy, old allies reappeared, hidden fleets came out of the shadows, and resistance movements that had long since fallen into obscurity began to rise again. The human fleet, once outnumbered and outmatched, now found itself standing alongside a coalition of species united in their desire to fight back. The mission was set. The target was the Yulren capital, a massive fortress planet at the heart of their empire. It was here that the Yulren held their most valuable resource, a weapon of unimaginable power, one that had been used to crush entire civilizations. If the humans could somehow infiltrate the planet and disable this weapon, they would have a chance to turn the tide of the war. But the Yulren knew the humans were coming. They always knew. The planet was heavily guarded, with fleets of warships orbiting it like vultures. But Evelyn had a plan, a risky, dangerous plan. They would strike fast, hit hard, and do whatever it took to make sure the Yulren couldn't stop them. The final assault began under the cover of darkness, with the human fleet and their allies moving in with deadly precision. The Yulren, however, were ready. Their warships appeared out of nowhere, and the battle erupted in a storm of laser fire and explosions. Ships from every race fought side by side, their weapons lighting up the sky. The Yulren were formidable, but the sheer will of the coalition was enough to keep them at bay, at least for a time. Evelyn's fleet led the charge, and soon they were within range of the capital itself. The ground assault began, with human soldiers and their allies infiltrating the planet's surface. The enemy defenses were brutal, but the humans pushed forward, their determination unwavering. They fought through cities, forests, and mountains, never giving up, always pressing toward their objective. Inside the capital, the Yulren's weapon was housed in a massive, heavily guarded fortress. Getting to it was nearly impossible, but the team Evelyn had assembled was the best the humans had to offer. They moved swiftly, silently, using every ounce of their training and ingenuity to avoid detection. When they reached the weapon, it was unlike anything they had ever seen, an energy core capable of wiping out entire star systems. It pulsed with an otherworldly power, casting an eerie glow on the walls around them. They knew they had little time. The Yulren were closing in. Evelyn's heart pounded as she gave the signal. The team placed the charges, and with one last look at the weapon, they began their retreat. But as they turned to leave, they were met by a group of Yulren soldiers, weapons raised and eyes full of fury. A firefight erupted, and the humans fought back with everything they had. But the Yulren were relentless. Just as they were about to be overrun, a voice crackled through Evelyn's comms. It was Max, back on the fleet. "Evelyn, we've got your back. The rest of the fleet is on its way. Hold your ground." The reinforcements arrived just in time, and the Yulren were forced to retreat. But the mission was not yet complete. With the weapon disabled, the coalition forces moved in for the final push, striking at the heart of the Yulren Empire. The battle was long and brutal, but in the end, the Yulren were defeated. The humans and their allies had achieved the impossible, not through overwhelming strength or advanced weaponry, but through the power of belief. They had shown the universe that even in the darkest of times, hope could light the way. As the dust settled and the galaxy began to heal, Admiral Evelyn Blackwood stood on the bridge of the eclipse, looking out at the stars. The war was not over, but it had changed. The spark of belief had ignited something greater than anyone could have imagined, a spark that would keep the fires of hope burning for generations to come. The war had stretched on for what felt like centuries. Across countless planets, the once vibrant civilizations of the galaxy had been reduced to rubble. The Zerathi Empire, with their unmatched technological might, had crushed every force that dared to oppose them. Their warriors, clad in near-invincible armor, had burned the stars of the weaker races, their fleets sailing through space like locusts devouring everything in their path. For years, the last surviving hope for freedom had been humanity, a ragtag force of survivors who had lost so much yet still dared to fight. They were the last resistance standing, but even they had begun to lose hope. The Zerathi were too powerful, and the end seemed inevitable. But as the final battle loomed on the horizon, the humans were about to discover something that could change the course of the galaxy forever. Admiral Sarah Hayes, commander of the human fleet, stood at the helm of the Phoenix, her flagship. The ship was battered, scared from countless battles, and her crew was weary. But Sarah was resolute. She had seen too much suffering, too much destruction, to back down now. The time had come for one last push. The Zerathi had built a fortress at the heart of their empire, a massive orbital platform called Eclipse, where they had placed a weapon capable of annihilating entire star systems. It was here that they would make their final stand. If they could destroy the Eclipse, they would cripple the Zerathi's power and finally bring an end to the war. The plan was simple but incredibly dangerous. The human fleet, along with their few remaining allies, would launch a full-scale assault on the Eclipse. Every ship, every soldier, every last ounce of energy would be spent in this final effort. There was no room for failure. If they didn't succeed, the galaxy would fall to the Zerathi, and humanity would be wiped out. It was a battle for survival, a fight for the very future of the galaxy. As the fleet prepared to launch, Sarah's thoughts turned to her crew. They had fought together through countless campaigns, each one harder than the last. There were no illusions left. Everyone knew that the odds were stacked against them. But the fight was no longer just about survival. It was about the chance for something greater, something worth fighting for. It was about the future of their children, the freedom of every world, and the belief that no matter how dark the night, the dawn would come. "Admiral," said Lieutenant Thomas, her most trusted officer, "we're ready. All ships are in position." Sarah nodded, her face hard with determination. "Then let's make it count." The battle began with an intensity that shook the very fabric of space. The Zerathi were ready. Their fleet was massive, easily dwarfing the human forces, and their orbital defenses were nearly impenetrable. But the humans had one advantage: their sheer will to fight. The Zerathi had never understood the power of the human spirit. They saw only weakness in their enemies, but they had underestimated what humanity could do when pushed to the brink. As the human fleet descended upon the eclipse, their ships engaged in fierce dogfights with the Zerathi warships. Explosions lit up the dark expanse of space, and the sky was filled with the sound of weapons fire. The Zerathi were relentless, their war machines showing no mercy, but the humans fought with a desperation that gave them an edge. Every shot fired was a promise that they would not go quietly into the night. Sarah's heart raced as she watched the battle unfold. She could see the sacrifice in her crew's eyes, the determination to push forward no matter the cost. Her own ship, the Phoenix, was taking heavy damage, but it kept pushing forward, its engines roaring with fury. She knew that the mission depended on them reaching the eclipse and destroying it. It would take everything they had, and more, to get there. "We've got a breach in the hull, Admiral," Lieutenant Thomas reported, his voice tense. "We're losing pressure in several sections. Seal off the damaged areas and keep pushing." Sarah barked, her voice sharp. "We're not stopping now." Through the chaos, they pushed forward, taking heavy losses, but refusing to retreat. The human fleet, though small, was a force unlike any the Zerathi had ever faced. The battle raged on, but the tide was beginning to turn. The Zerathi fleet was beginning to falter under the relentless assault of the humans and their allies. They had underestimated the power of belief, the power of a cause that could inspire even the most broken of soldiers to keep fighting. As they neared the eclipse, Sarah's ship took a critical hit, sending it spiraling toward the surface of the massive orbital station. The Phoenix's shields flickered, and the lights dimmed. There was no time to waste. The human forces pressed on, their ships swarming the surface of the eclipse. The remaining fighters fought desperately to clear a path for the ground assault team, led by Captain Michael Drake, a seasoned warrior who had seen the horrors of war firsthand. "Team, this is it," Captain Drake said, his voice steady over the comms. "We land, we plant the charges, and we get out. No heroics, just the mission." The ground assault was just as brutal as the battle in space. The Zerathi had turned their last line of defense into a fortress. Armed with energy shields and plasma weapons, they fought to hold their ground. But Captain Drake's team was relentless, cutting through the enemy ranks with precision and determination. They pushed forward, clearing the way to the heart of the eclipse, where the weapon that could end it all awaited. In the command center of the eclipse, General Korath, leader of the Zerathi forces, watched as the humans closed in on their objective. He had long believed in the superiority of the Zerathi, in their unshakable strength and technology. But now, as he watched the human forces push forward with such unyielding resolve, he began to question everything. The humans were not just fighting for their survival, they were fighting for something greater, something the Zerathi could never understand. "We can't let them succeed, General," one of Korath's officers shouted, panic in his voice. "The weapon must remain operational." Korath's eyes narrowed. "We will not fall to them. Prepare the final defense." But it was too late. Captain Drake's team had reached the weapon's core, and within moments, they had planted the explosive charges. The countdown began, and there was no turning back. The humans had done the impossible. They had reached the heart of the Zerathi Empire, and were about to deliver the final blow. The explosion was cataclysmic. The eclipse shattered, its massive structure breaking apart in a fiery explosion that lit up the galaxy. The Zerethi fleet, thrown into disarray, scattered into retreat as their greatest weapon was destroyed.